The oil that kept the Japanese Empire alive moved north by sea. It rode in the tanks of merchant ships that crossed thousands of miles of open water, from the conquered oil fields of the south to the refineries of the home islands, and that long passage was the thread on which the whole empire hung. By the autumn of 1944, it had become the most dangerous voyage in the Pacific. A tanker leaving Singapore or the ports of Borneo would gather into a small convoy, take on an escort, and steam north through the narrow seas off Formosa and Luzon, where the American submarines waited thickest. Its lookouts watched the horizon for the feather of a periscope. Its escort swept the water ahead with its listening gear. Every rule the Imperial Japanese Navy had managed to write for the protection of its shipping was being obeyed. And still, again and again, the torpedoes came without warning out of an empty sea, and the tanker and the oil it carried went to the bottom. What made these sinkings so strange to the men who lived through them was not simply that they happened, but that they seemed to come from nowhere. The submarine that fired had usually not stumbled onto the convoy by luck. Time and again it had been sent to that exact stretch of ocean because cryptanalysts thousands of miles away had already read the Japanese signal that ordered the convoy to sea. The submarine often knew a tanker's route and speed and cargo before the tanker's own lookouts had seen anything at all. The first sign of danger was the shock of the explosion against the hull, and by then nothing could be done. The sea that had seemed to hide the ship was the very thing that swallowed it. This happened hundreds of times between 1943 and 1945, and the men who survived it, the merchant officers and naval staff who lived to be questioned after the surrender, described it in a way that ought to strike us as strange. They did not say the Americans had simply found them. They said, again and again, that they could not understand how they were being destroyed. Their warships were still afloat. The great fleet action they had prepared for, across a generation, had not been fought and lost. By the logic they had been taught, the empire could not yet be beaten. And yet the empire was quietly starving to death, one sunken tanker at a time, and the officers responsible for stopping it could not explain the mechanism that was killing them. Consider the shape of the puzzle. Japan and the United States both built large submarine fleets before the war. Both entered the conflict with modern boats and trained crews. The Japanese submarine was, in several respects, the more impressive machine. It ran faster on the surface, dived deeper, and carried the finest torpedo of the age, a weapon so superior to anything the Americans had that it belongs in a category of its own. By any inventory of hardware taken in 1941, the Imperial Navy's undersea arm was the equal of its enemies, and in some ways the better of the two. Yet across nearly 4 years of war, the Japanese submarine force sank a modest tally of warships and merchant vessels and achieved nothing that altered the course of the conflict. The American submarine force, starting from rougher material, strangled an entire industrial empire to death. Same weapon, same ocean, opposite outcomes. Why? The answer has almost nothing to do with the submarines themselves. It has nothing to do with braver crews or sharper captains, and the Japanese captains were often very brave and very sharp. It has nothing to do with a superior boat, because for the first 2 years of the war, the American boat was crippled by a defect so severe it nearly lost the campaign before it began. The answer lies in a decision made in the first hours of the war, in a theory of victory that one navy had quietly built and the other had refused to imagine. To understand why the same weapon strangled one empire and barely scratched the other, you have to understand that the two navies were not fighting the same war. They were not even trying to win the same way. One of them was hunting warships. The other had stopped caring about warships almost entirely and had gone looking for something far more fragile. To see why Japan could not answer this campaign, you first have to take seriously the thing Japan built instead, because it was, on its own terms, magnificent. The Imperial Japanese Navy of 1941 was one of the most formidable fighting instruments ever assembled on the sea. It had been shaped, deliberately and over decades, around a single idea. The idea was called the decisive battle, and in Japanese it was known as Kantai Kessen. The concept came in part from the writings of an American naval theorist, Alfred Thayer Mahan, whose work on sea power was studied as closely in Tokyo as it was anywhere on Earth. Mahan taught that command of the sea was won by concentrating your battle fleet and destroying the enemy's battle fleet in one overwhelming engagement. Everything else, commerce, blockade, the slow grind of attrition, was secondary to that single climactic clash of capital ships. For Japan, this was not merely a theory imported from a book. It was written into the nation's memory in blood and triumph. In 1905, in the Tsushima Strait, the Japanese fleet under Admiral Togo had met the Russian fleet that had sailed halfway around the world to relieve the siege of Port Arthur. In a matter of hours, the Japanese annihilated it. 2/3 of the Russian ships were sunk or captured. It was one of the most complete naval victories in modern history, and it ended a war against a great European power in Japan's favor. An entire generation of Japanese naval officers grew up in the shadow of that afternoon. The lesson they drew was total. Wars at sea were decided by one great battle between battle fleets, and the navy that built the biggest guns and the heaviest armor and trained the hardest for that single day would win. From this conviction flowed a whole philosophy of shipbuilding, summed up in a Japanese phrase that translates as, "the doctrine of big ships and great guns." If the war would be settled by a clash of giants, then Japan would build giants. The ambition reached its peak in the battleships Yamato and Musashi, the largest and most heavily armed warships ever constructed, each mounting guns of a caliber no other navy would match. These were beautiful, terrifying machines, the physical expression of a coherent and intelligent theory of naval war. The men who designed them, and the officers who longed to command them, were not fools. They had a model of how their war would be won, and every rivet of the fleet served that model. The plan, in outline, was to let the American fleet steam across the vast Pacific toward Japan, whittling it down along the way with aircraft and submarines and light forces, until the weakened Americans could be met by the full Japanese battle line in home waters and destroyed in a second Tsushima. It was elegant, it was internally consistent, and it was the wrong war. There was another force pushing Japan toward this doctrine, and it came from the treaty table. In the naval treaties of the 1920s and early 1930s, the great powers had agreed to limit the size of their battle fleets, and Japan had been held to a smaller ratio of capital ships than the United States and Britain. Denied the ability to match the Americans ship for ship, the Japanese Navy resolved to make each of its ships better, and to make its plan for the decisive battle so refined that quality and cunning would overcome numbers. The whole edifice of superb training, powerful individual ships, and the long-rehearsed interception of an advancing American fleet was, in part, an answer to being outnumbered by treaty. It reinforced the fixation on the one great battle. A navy that expected to be outnumbered in a long war had every incentive to bet everything on a short one, decided in a single climactic engagement, which meant, once again, that the slow war of attrition against shipping was the last thing the Imperial Navy wished to imagine, because in a long war of attrition, the side with the larger industry would win, and Japan knew perfectly well which side that was. If accounts like this one, the forgotten machinery of how wars are actually decided, are the kind of history you want more of, then consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this work reach the people who care about getting the details right. Look closely at how that doctrine shaped the fleet, because the shape is the whole story. A navy built for one decisive battle is a navy built for offense, for the glorious day of action. It pours its steel and its best officers into battleships and fleet carriers and heavy cruisers, the ships that will stand in the line and fire the great salvos. What such a navy does not value, what it can barely bring itself to think about, is the unglamorous work of protecting its own merchant shipping, escort duty, convoy shepherding, the patient hunting of enemy submarines. All of it was regarded within the Imperial Navy as monotonous and defensive, beneath the dignity of a fighting officer who dreamed of the decisive day. The most capable men were not sent to that work. The newest technology was not built for it. The whole apparatus of commerce protection that the Allies would pour their genius into across the Atlantic was, in the Japanese Navy, an afterthought given to old ships and second-rank crews. The neglect was visible in the smallest technical choices. Japan built almost no dedicated escort vessels in the years before the war, nothing like the cheap, mass-produced escort ships and escort carriers the Allies would turn out by the hundred. Its depth charges, the primary weapon against a submerged submarine, were for a long time set to explode at shallow depths, which allowed American boats to escape simply by diving deeper than the Japanese believed they could go, a weakness the Americans exploited for far too long before it was corrected. Anti-submarine training was rudimentary. Radar and underwater listening gear arrived late and in small numbers. Every one of these was a solvable problem, and everyone went unsolved for years, not because Japanese engineers were incapable, but because the Navy that set the priorities did not consider the defense of merchant shipping worth solving them for. And here is the part that makes the neglect almost impossible to believe. No nation on earth was more dependent on its merchant shipping than Japan. The home islands are poor in almost everything a modern industrial war requires. They had little oil, little iron ore, little of the bauxite that becomes aluminum for aircraft, little rubber, and not even enough food to feed the population without imports. Every one of those things had to be carried across the sea in the holds of merchant ships. The entire strategic reason for the war, the seizure of the southern resource area, the oil of the Dutch East Indies, and the tin and rubber of Malaya, only made sense if those resources could be shipped home. Japan had gone to war to secure a lifeline that ran through thousands of miles of open ocean, and had then built a navy that regarded the defense of that lifeline as a chore. The empire's entire existence hung from a thread of merchant hulls, and the navy that was supposed to guard the thread had its eyes fixed on a battle that would never come. The numbers behind that dependence were stark. Before the war, Japan imported the great majority of its oil, and most of that came from the very country it was about to fight, the United States. When Washington, responding to Japanese expansion in Asia, froze Japanese assets and cut off that oil in the summer of 1941, the Japanese leadership faced a simple and terrible arithmetic. The Navy's fuel reserves would run dry in about 2 years. Either Japan abandoned its ambitions on the Asian mainland, or it seized the oil fields of the South by force before the reserves were gone. The decision for war was, at its core, a decision about oil, and oil, like everything else, could only reach the home islands by ship. The empire chose to fight a war for resources it could only keep if its merchant fleet survived, and then entrusted that fleet to a navy that would not defend it. The whole enterprise rested on an assumption of light shipping losses that the first year of unrestricted American attacks would begin, slowly, to destroy. At the start of the war, Japan possessed a merchant fleet of roughly 6 million tons. It was barely enough to carry the imports the home economy needed, even in peacetime, with almost no margin for the demands of a long war or for losses. The planners in Tokyo assumed those losses would be light. They assumed the war would be short and would end in a negotiated peace after the decisive battle was won. They assumed, above all, that the Americans would use their submarines the way Japan intended to use its own, as scouts and as hunters of warships, ranging ahead of the fleet and picking off cruisers and carriers. It was a reasonable assumption because it was exactly what the Japanese Navy planned to do. It simply happened to be wrong about the enemy in the most catastrophic way imaginable. To feel the weight of what was coming, you have to understand what the merchant fleet actually was. It was not an abstraction on a planner's chart. It was the tankers that carried the fuel for every warship and every aircraft. It was the ore carriers that fed the steel mills. It was the freighters that moved troops and ammunition to the island garrisons scattered across the Pacific. When those ships began to sink faster than Japan could build replacements, everything downstream of them began to fail at once. The fleet that could not be fueled could not sail. The factory that could not be supplied with ore could not make steel. The aircraft that could not be given fuel could not train new pilots. A merchant ship going down in the Luzon Strait was not a single loss. It was a cut in an artery, and the empire had far fewer arteries than it could afford to lose. Now a fair objection arises, and it deserves an honest answer. Japan lost the war. The reader knows this. So perhaps this neglect of shipping was simply one failure among many in a doomed cause, not worth singling out. But that is not what the evidence shows. Judged on its own terms, in the specific contest between the American submarine and the Japanese merchant marine, the outcome was not close, and it was not incidental. It was the decisive campaign of the Pacific War, and it was decisive precisely because the Japanese never built an answer to it. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, the exhaustive study the Americans conducted after the surrender to learn what had actually broken Japan, concluded that the war against shipping was perhaps the most decisive single factor in the collapse of the Japanese economy and the whole logistic support of Japanese military power. Not one factor among many, the most decisive single factor. The men who wrote that had access to the captured records and the interrogated officials, and that was their verdict. The doctrine that made Japan vulnerable was not stupidity. This is the essential point, and it mirrors something true of every side in this war. The officers who staffed the Imperial Navy were experienced, disciplined professionals, many of them educated in the finest naval traditions in the world. Their error was not incompetence. It was a hidden assumption buried so deep in their theory of war that they could not see it, and it was an assumption the enemy shared right up until the war began. The assumption was that naval war is decided by combat between fighting ships. Sink the enemy's warships, protect your own, and the sea is yours. Commerce, in this view, is a consequence of victory, not the object of it. You win the battles first, and the shipping follows. Both navies believed this. The difference is that one of them changed its mind in the space of a single afternoon, and the other never did. Listen to the men who lived inside the failure, because their words are more damning than any outside judgment. After the war, a Japanese naval officer named Atsushi Oi, who had served on the staff of the Escort Command from the day it was created, tried to explain to his American interrogators, and later in his own writing, why Japan's defense of its shipping had failed so completely. He put his finger on the cultural root of it. Japanese naval men, he wrote, preferred colorful and offensive fighting to monotonous and defensive warfare, and so convoy escort and anti-submarine work were never jobs the Navy welcomed. He also identified the fatal misjudgment about the enemy. Japan, he said, had taken it for granted that American submarines would play the same role as her own, hunting warships, and had therefore slighted the danger of the submarine as a commerce raider. When his American questioners asked him directly which form of American attack had done the most harm, Oi did not hesitate. The submarines, he told them, were the worst. Up to the end of 1944, he said, they were the most terrible attack force of all. This was the man responsible for stopping them, admitting after the fact that he had never been given the means to do it. Nothing captures the imbalance more sharply than a single moment from June 1944, during the Great Carrier Battle in the Philippine Sea. The Japanese had gathered their fleet for exactly the kind of decisive action their whole doctrine was built around. And on the morning of June 19, 2 American submarines struck at the heart of that fleet. One of them put a spread of torpedoes into the brand-new fleet carrier Taiho, the pride of the Japanese Navy, and the flagship of the admiral commanding the operation. The other sank the veteran carrier Shokaku, a ship that had been present at Pearl Harbor. The Taiho did not sink from the torpedo alone. She sank hours later when leaking fuel vapor, mishandled by an inexperienced damage control crew, filled the ship and exploded. 2 of the most valuable warships in the Imperial Navy, gone in a single day, in the middle of the decisive battle they had sought, killed by the weapon their doctrine had dismissed as a scout. The submarines were not supposed to be able to do this. According to the theory Japan had trained inside for 40 years, they were a supporting arm. In reality, they were becoming the main event. What neither navy fully understood in the first days of the war was that a completely different theory of victory was about to be set loose in the Pacific, one that did not care about the decisive battle at all. It did not aim at the enemy's fleet. It aimed at everything the fleet existed to protect. And the astonishing thing, the thing that makes this a genuine story rather than a simple case of one side being cleverer, is that the United States Navy did not enter the war believing in this theory either. The American submarine, before December 1941, was designed and its crews were trained for almost exactly the same mission the Japanese imagined, scouting for the battle fleet and attacking enemy warships. The revolution did not come from a doctrine carefully worked out in peacetime. It came from a single order, issued within hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, that tore up decades of law and training in one sentence. On the afternoon of December 7, 1941, with the wreckage at Pearl Harbor still burning, the Chief of Naval Operations in Washington sent a message to the Pacific Fleet. Execute against Japan unrestricted air and submarine warfare. 6 words, and they reversed a position the United States had held and preached for a generation. Unrestricted submarine warfare meant sinking enemy merchant ships on sight, without warning, without stopping to ensure the safety of their crews. This was the very practice the United States had condemned as barbarism when German U-boats waged it in the previous war. It had been one of the stated reasons America entered the First World War against Germany. The United States had signed international agreements limiting it. And now, in a single afternoon, with the fleet in ruins, all of that was swept aside. American submarines were ordered to do to Japan precisely what America had gone to war to stop Germany from doing to the world. There was no lengthy debate, no careful reasoning through the moral and legal questions. The order went out, and the character of the entire Pacific War was set. It is worth pausing on how complete a reversal this was, because the American submarine force had spent the interwar years training for something else entirely. Its boats were conceived as the eyes of the battle fleet, fast scouts that would range ahead, report the enemy's position, and attack his heavy warships. Commerce raiding was barely discussed, and when it was discussed as something the enemy might do, not as America's own plan. The man who would soon command the whole Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz, was himself an old submariner who had grown up in that scouting tradition. Neither he nor the doctrine he had been raised in had imagined the submarine as the instrument that would bring an empire to its knees by sinking its freighters. The order of December 7 did not reflect a settled American belief in commerce warfare. It reflected a navy that had just been savaged at Pearl Harbor and was reaching for any weapon that could strike back at once. The theory of victory would be discovered later, in the doing. That decision alone would have meant little without the boat to carry it out, and here Japan's geography handed the Americans a gift they had prepared for by accident. The Pacific is enormous. To scout for a battle fleet across those distances, the United States had built a submarine unlike the smaller coastal boats of the European navies. The American fleet boat, the Gato and Balao classes that would carry the war to Japan, was a large, long-ranged, ocean-going submarine. It could steam roughly 11,000 nautical miles without refueling. It could stay at sea on a single war patrol for as long as 75 days. It carried 10 torpedo tubes and 24 torpedoes, and later boats could dive to 400 feet. It was built to be habitable across weeks in the tropics, with air conditioning and refrigeration that let a crew stay effective through the long, hot patrols. This boat had been designed to range far ahead of the battle line and shadow the enemy fleet. Turned loose on Japan's merchant lifeline instead, it was very nearly the perfect commerce raider, able to reach the shipping lanes off the Japanese coast, off Formosa, and deep into the South China Sea, and to loiter there for weeks. The weapon built for the decisive battle became the weapon that made the decisive battle irrelevant. And yet, for all of that, the campaign very nearly failed at the start, and it failed for a reason that had nothing to do with the enemy. It failed because the American torpedo did not work. This is the part of the story that American accounts long preferred to forget, and it is the reason the reversal at the heart of this tale is not a simple parable of the better navy winning. For the first year and a half of the war, the standard American submarine torpedo, the Mark 14, was a catastrophe. It suffered not one defect but a stack of them, and each one hid behind the others, so that as fast as the submariners diagnosed one fault, another was waiting underneath. The first fault was depth. The Mark 14 ran deeper than it was set to run, often 10 feet or more too deep, which meant that torpedoes aimed to strike a ship's hull passed harmlessly beneath the keel. Crews reported it from the first weeks of the war, and the Ordnance Bureau that had designed the weapon insisted the crews were simply aiming badly. The second fault lay in the exploder. The Mark 14 carried a sophisticated magnetic exploder meant to detonate the warhead beneath a ship's hull by sensing the ship's magnetic field, breaking the target's back without a direct hit. In the waters of the Pacific, it malfunctioned constantly, detonating early, detonating late, or firing far from the target and warning the enemy that a submarine was near. The third fault was the cruelest. When a submarine did everything right, closed to a perfect position, and fired so that the torpedo struck the target squarely at a right angle, the contact detonator that was supposed to fire on impact was crushed by the force of the collision before it could function. The firing pin was too fragile to survive the very hit it was designed for. A glancing blow might explode. A perfect shot, the kind every submarine officer was trained to achieve, was the most likely of all to produce nothing but a dull clang against the enemy hull and a torpedo that sank without firing. The cost of this failure is hard to overstate, and much of it was paid in missed chances and broken confidence rather than in anything the enemy did. Again and again through 1942 and into 1943, American submarines worked into perfect firing positions against valuable Japanese ships, fired, and watched their targets steam away unharmed. Captains came home from patrol reporting hits that produced no explosions and were met with disbelief. The Bureau of Ordnance, which had designed and tested the torpedo and staked its reputation on it, was reluctant to accept that the fault lay in the weapon rather than in the men firing it. Some captains were relieved of their commands for a supposed lack of aggressiveness when the plain truth was that their torpedoes had betrayed them. For a service that was supposed to be carrying the war to Japan in its darkest first year, it was a demoralizing ordeal, and it meant that the strangulation of Japan, which could have begun in earnest in 1942, did not truly begin until late 1943, once the weapon was finally made to work. The moment that finally forced the truth into the open came in July 1943. A submarine named Tinosa, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit, came upon a large Japanese whale factory tanker, a fat, slow target of more than 19,000 tons, dead in the water and unescorted. It was the kind of chance a submarine captain might wait a whole career for. Daspit fired and hit and stopped the tanker cold. Then, with the target motionless and helpless, he did what amounted to a controlled experiment. He fired his remaining torpedoes one at a time from a textbook position, carefully checking his aim, watching each one run straight and true to the target. One after another they struck the stationary hull and failed to explode. He fired something like a dozen torpedoes into a sitting target and watched almost all of them do nothing at all. He brought his last torpedo home unfired so the engineers could examine it. Daspit returned to Pearl Harbor not with a triumph, but with proof, delivered by a furious and meticulous officer, that the weapon was broken. That proof reached the right man. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, who commanded the Pacific Submarine Force, had already been fighting the Ordnance Bureau over the depth problem, running his own tests by firing torpedoes through fishing nets to measure how deep they truly ran. Now, with the exploder failures laid bare, Lockwood took the investigation into his own hands rather than wait for the distant bureau to admit fault. His people fired live torpedoes against an undersea cliff and recovered the duds to see what had gone wrong. They dropped dummy warheads from a crane onto steel plates to reproduce the crushing of the firing pin. Step by step they found each fault and forced a fix. The magnetic exploder was ordered deactivated. The firing pin was redesigned to survive a square hit. The depth setting was corrected. By the last months of 1943, roughly 2 years into the war, the American submarine finally had a torpedo that worked. From that point, the sinkings climbed steeply, and they never came back down. The near disaster is essential to the story because it shows that the American advantage was not some innate superiority of men or machines. For 2 years the machine was worse than useless, and the campaign survived only because the men in the boats and the admiral over them refused to accept that their own weapon was the enemy. Step for a moment back into the Japanese position, now that the torpedo has been fixed, and the strangeness the officers described begins to make sense. Merchant ships steaming north from Singapore in 1944 did everything correctly. They sailed in convoy. They zigzagged. Their escorts listened for submarines. And still the torpedoes came. And still there was no warning. And still, when the survivors were questioned, they could not say how they had been found. From inside the Japanese theory of war, this was genuinely inexplicable. Detection was supposed to precede destruction. A ship was supposed to be sunk after it had been sighted and stalked. But the ships were being sunk by submarines that had known where they would be before they ever left port, and no lookout on the deck of a tanker could see that. The killing was arriving from a direction the Japanese doctrine did not contain, because the fixed torpedo and the long-ranged boat were still only part of the American system. The deepest part, the part the Japanese never understood was operating against them, worked far from any ocean, in windowless rooms full of cryptanalysts. American codebreakers had broken into the Japanese merchant marine's own cipher, the system that governed the movement of the Maru fleet, the merchant ships whose names so often ended in the word Maru. By early 1943, American intelligence was reading the messages that told Japanese convoys where to sail, when to leave, what route to follow, and often what they carried. That information, handled under the strictest secrecy and known by the code word Ultra, was fed to the submarine force. It meant that a boat did not have to wander the ocean hoping to stumble on a target. It could be positioned directly across the path of a convoy whose schedule the Americans had read days in advance. In the space of 10 months in 1943, this flow of intelligence pointed submarine commanders toward hundreds of specific targets. The submarine was the blade, but the codebreakers told the blade exactly where to fall. The secret was guarded with extraordinary care, because its whole value depended on the Japanese never suspecting that their shipping codes had been broken. Positions of targets were sometimes attributed, in the records, to routine patrol or to aircraft, so that no pattern would betray the true source. When a submarine sank a ship the codebreakers had flagged, the same intelligence stream often reported the loss back through intercepted Japanese messages, confirming the kill and sharpening the picture for the next attack. It was a closed loop of astonishing efficiency. The enemy announced where his ships were going, the codebreakers read the announcement, the submarines were sent to the spot, and the enemy then reported his own losses back into the system that had caused them. The Japanese changed their codes from time to time and caused the Americans real difficulty when they did, but they never grasped that the leak in their shipping was, in large part, a leak in their ciphers, and so they never fixed the true problem. The Americans sharpened the weapon further with the way they used it. From late 1943, they began sending their submarines out, not singly, but in coordinated groups, several boats working together against the same convoy, one finding and reporting it, while the others moved into position to attack from different sides. Against a Japanese escort system that was thin, poorly coordinated, and short of good radar, these tactics were murderous. A convoy that might have fought off a single submarine could be overwhelmed by 3 or 4 striking in concert, guided to the meeting by intelligence and pressing home their attacks over successive nights until little of the convoy was left. The hunting became systematic. The ocean that Japan needed to cross was turning, lane by lane, into a killing ground its ships could not avoid and its navy could not clear. This was the true engine of the tanker war, and the tanker war was where the empire was actually killed. As the American submarines multiplied and their intelligence sharpened, they turned with deliberate purpose on Japan's oil. Tankers became the priority target, because oil was the resource the whole empire most desperately needed and could least replace. The pressure came from more than the submarines alone. In February 1944, an American carrier raid fell on the great Japanese anchorage at Truk in the Central Pacific and destroyed a mass of merchant shipping caught there, including several large tankers. But it was the submarines, patient and everywhere, that did the sustained work, month after month, on every route the tankers had to use. The results can be read in the flow of oil to the home islands, and the numbers describe a slow suffocation. In August 1943, Japan was still importing something on the order of 1.75 million barrels of oil a month from the southern fields. A year later, in the summer of 1944, that figure had collapsed to a fraction of what it had been. By the final stretch of the war, only a tiny percentage of the oil loaded in the south was reaching Japan at all. The rest was on the bottom of the sea. The last tanker to bring southern oil through to the home islands arrived in the spring of 1945. After that, the oil that the entire war had been fought to secure simply stopped coming. The consequences cascaded through everything. Warships sat in harbor because there was no fuel to sail them. The Imperial Navy, the proud instrument built for the decisive battle, was in its final months partly immobilized not by enemy gunfire, but by empty fuel tanks. Pilot training was cut back savagely because there was no aviation fuel to spare, which meant that the new pilots sent to face the Americans were half-trained, which meant they died in droves, which meant the training problem grew worse still. Japanese engineers, desperate, tried to distill fuel from the roots of pine trees, mobilizing schoolchildren to dig them up, an effort that consumed enormous labor and produced almost nothing usable. And oil was only the most acute of the shortages. As the shipping shrank, iron ore and coal stopped arriving too. By the spring of 1945, coal imports had nearly ceased, and iron ore had been cut off almost entirely, because Japan was forced to spend its last remaining ships not on the raw materials of war, but on the simple food needed to keep its people alive. Steel production fell away. The share of army supplies sent to the islands that was sunk before it ever arrived rose year by year until, in the last year of the war, as much as half of everything the army shipped went to the bottom. The failure of shipping reached far beyond the factories and the fuel tanks. Across the Pacific, Japan had planted garrisons on hundreds of islands, tens of thousands of soldiers who depended entirely on the sea for their food and ammunition. As the merchant fleet was destroyed, those garrisons were cut off one by one. Many were never conquered in battle at all. They were simply bypassed by the advancing Americans and left to wither, their supply ships resting on the sea floor, their soldiers reduced to farming and foraging, while the war moved on past them toward Japan. An army can only fight where it can be fed, and a fleet can only sail where it can be fueled, and both of those simple facts ran through the holds of merchant ships that were vanishing faster than they could ever be replaced. The empire was not only losing its industry, it was losing the ability to hold the very territory it had gone to war to seize. And behind the industrial figures lay something more basic. The home islands were beginning to starve. The average ration fell steadily until, by the summer of 1945, the calories available to an ordinary Japanese civilian had dropped toward a level that could not sustain health over time. The bombing survey later judged that intake had fallen to around 3/4 of the minimum a person needed. Japan was not merely losing battles, it was being cut off from food, from fuel, from the metal of war, all at once, by ships it could never see and could not stop. This was the strangulation, and it was happening while the great fleet action the Navy had waited for still had not been fought. If this account is holding your attention, a like helps it reach more people, and subscribing means the next one of these finds its way to you. Before turning to why Japan could never answer this, it is worth seeing the campaign at the height of its power, through a few of the boats that waged it, because the abstraction of tonnage becomes real in what they did. By the last full year of the war, the American submarine, at last armed with a torpedo that worked and guided by intelligence that rarely failed, had become the most efficient commerce destroyer in the history of naval warfare. Consider the submarine Archerfish, and the night of November 29, 1944. Off the coast of Japan, she encountered a target so large her commander, Joseph Enright, at first could scarcely credit its size. It was the carrier Shinano, built on the hull of a third super battleship of the Yamato class, and converted into what was then the largest aircraft carrier in the world, displacing well over 60,000 tons. She was brand new, on her maiden voyage, hurried to sea before her watertight compartments had been properly tested and before her crew had learned her. Archerfish stalked her through the night and fired a spread of torpedoes. 4 of them struck home. The flooding spread through a ship whose damage control was not ready to contain it, and the greatest warship of her kind slipped beneath the sea a few hours later, sunk on her first voyage by a single submarine. She remains the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine, a record that still stands. It was the doctrine of the great ship and the great gun, meeting the weapon that doctrine had dismissed, at the largest scale imaginable. Consider the submarine Tang, under Richard O'Kane, the most successful American submarine of the war, measured by the tonnage she sank. Across a handful of ferocious patrols she tore through Japanese shipping, with a boldness that bordered on the reckless, closing to point-blank range, and firing with deadly precision. Her end, in October 1944, is one of the cruel ironies of the whole campaign. After sinking her targets in a night surface attack, Tang fired her last torpedo, and that torpedo malfunctioned, curved back through the water in a circle, and struck the submarine that had launched it. Tang went down at the hands of her own weapon. O'Kane survived, was captured, and endured the rest of the war as a prisoner, and later received his nation's highest decoration for valor. Even at the campaign's most lethal, the imperfect torpedo could still turn on the men who trusted it. Consider the submarine Barb, commanded by Eugene Fluckey, whose patrols became legendary. Fluckey sank an escort carrier and a great deal of other shipping, but he is remembered above all for a raid so audacious it sounds invented. Late in the war, he put a small party of his crew ashore on the coast of a Japanese-held island, where they planted an explosive charge on a railway line and destroyed a passing train, one of the very few times American forces struck a target on Japanese-controlled land during the entire Pacific War. He, too, received the highest decoration for valor. And consider the submarine Tautog, which sank more individual ships than any other American submarine of the war, more than 24 of them, a patient, methodical record of destruction spread across the length of the conflict. These were not lucky accidents. They were the visible edge of a machine working exactly as it had been built to work, and multiplied across the dozens of boats on patrol at any given moment. They added up to the quiet extinction of a merchant marine. This is what the fixed torpedo and the long-ranged boat and the broken codes produced once they were finally brought together. And it is against this that the Japanese defense must be measured, and found not merely wanting, but very nearly absent. The reason Japan could never build an answer is not that it lacked any of the individual pieces. This is the point that turns a story of hardware into a story of ideas. Japan had submarines, and good ones. Japan had codes, and could read some of the enemy's traffic. Japan had escort vessels and depth charges, and, eventually, radar and sonar of its own. What Japan never assembled was the combination, running as a single coordinated system all the way down from the codebreaker's desk to the individual submarine on patrol and the individual escort at sea. The Americans had welded 4 separate things into one machine. They had a doctrine, unrestricted warfare, that pointed the whole force at the enemy's commerce. They had a boat with the range to reach that commerce and stay. They had, after a painful struggle, a torpedo that actually sank what it hit. And they had an intelligence pipeline that told the boat where the commerce would be. Each piece alone was ordinary. Bolted together, they formed something no navy had ever built before, an integrated campaign of economic strangulation waged with industrial patience across 3 years. Japan could not build the same machine, and the reasons run deeper than any single decision. They reach into the culture of the Navy itself. The Imperial Navy had organized its entire being around the initiative and the fighting spirit of the individual commander, around the pursuit of the glorious decisive action. That culture produced magnificent fighting officers and a fleet of extraordinary offensive power. What it could not produce was the patient, unglamorous, deeply coordinated defensive system that the shipping war demanded, because that system required the Navy to value exactly the things it had taught itself to despise. It required treating the protection of a merchant convoy as being as important as a battleship duel. It required pouring the best minds and the newest equipment into escort work. It required the Navy to admit that the war might be decided not by the fleet at all, but by the safe passage of oil tankers, and to that admission, the Imperial Navy was constitutionally, almost spiritually, unable to come. Underneath it all lay two different ideas of what war even was. The American way of fighting this campaign treated war as a problem of engineering and organization, a system to be designed in advance and then run with industrial patience, in which the individual captain was one carefully placed part of a much larger machine of intelligence, production, and coordination. The Japanese way exalted the spirit and the will of the fighting man and the decisive stroke of the bold commander. Both produced remarkable soldiers and sailors, but only one of them produced a network that could find a convoy through broken codes, position boats across its path, and sink it night after night as a matter of routine, whichever particular captain happened to be on patrol. The strangulation of Japan was not a triumph of braver men. It was the triumph of a system over a spirit, in a war whose conditions rewarded the one and punished the other. By the time the Navy tried, it was far too late. Only in November 1943, with the shipping losses already becoming ruinous, did Japan finally create a dedicated command to organize the defense of its merchant fleet, the Grand Escort Command. It was handed to Admiral Koshiro Oikawa, and it was given the leftovers, old destroyers and small escort craft, and too few of everything. Oikawa is said to have understood the futility of his own appointment. Creating the command at that stage, he reportedly remarked, might be like calling a doctor after the patient has already fallen critically ill. He was right. The escorts lacked effective radar until late in the war. The convoys were small and poorly organized. When radar warning sets did begin to reach the escorts, they could tell a crew that a submarine's signal was somewhere nearby, but not reliably where, which was little help against a boat that struck and vanished. Japan reshuffled its escort arrangements again in the summer of 1944, but the change came too late to matter, as Oi himself admitted, and the losses only mounted. The men and ships assigned to the work had never been the Navy's priority and could not be made into a war-winning force in the middle of the disaster they were meant to prevent. 2 years after the American order to wage unrestricted war, Japan finally organized to resist it, and by then, the arithmetic was already fatal. There is a final irony that sharpens the whole picture, and it cuts against any easy conclusion that the Americans were simply the wiser Navy. In the discipline the Japanese had mastered, the tactics of the fleet and the fighting of the surface battle, the Imperial Navy was often the superior force and remained so well into the war. And in the specific idea that finally destroyed Japan, the idea of the submarine as a commerce raider, the United States had not believed either. American submarine doctrine before the war pointed at warships, just as Japan's did. The United States did not outthink Japan on the value of commerce raiding in some grand peacetime insight. It backed into the strategy through a single furious order on the day of Pearl Harbor, and then it was pushed the rest of the way by the accident of having built long-ranged boats for another purpose, and by codebreakers who happened to crack the right cipher. The victory grew as much from improvisation and luck and stubbornness as from foresight. What separated the two navies in the end was not that one had planned the strangulation and the other had not. Neither had planned it. It was that when the possibility appeared, one navy seized it with total commitment and built a system around it, and the other could not even see it happening until the empire was already dying. So here is the honest verdict. The Japanese naval officer did not fail through cowardice or stupidity. His fleet did not fail through weakness of design. His doctrine did not fail because it was crude. It failed because it was the answer to a question the enemy had refused to ask. Japan had built, with great skill and great sacrifice, the finest possible instrument for winning a decisive battle between fleets. The United States declined to fight that battle on Japan's terms, and instead attacked the thin, undefended lifeline of merchant shipping on which the entire empire floated. Two coherent theories of naval war collided in the Pacific. One held that you win by destroying the enemy's fighting fleet. The other held that you win by cutting the enemy off from the oil and ore and food, without which no fleet can fight at all. Both theories were intelligent. Both had a long pedigree. Only one of them fit the actual conditions of a war between a resource-starved island empire and a continental industrial power that could read its mail and hunt its tankers at will. That is why the officers questioned after the surrender could not explain what had happened to them. Their framework had no room for it. In their model of war, an undefeated fleet meant an undefeated nation, and their fleet, whatever its losses, had never been destroyed in the great battle that was supposed to decide everything. By their logic, they should not have lost. And yet the oil was gone, the factories were still, the people were hungry, and the ships that had done it had killed the empire without ever facing the battle line that was built to stop them. They had prepared, with all their intelligence and all their courage, for a war that never arrived, and they were beaten by one they had refused to imagine. The tale does not end in bitterness, and it does not end in myth. The men who waged the American campaign paid for it. The submarine service was a small fraction of the United States Navy, well under 2% of its personnel, yet it accounted for more than half of all the Japanese ships sent to the bottom, and by tonnage, an even larger share. 52 American submarines were lost, and roughly 3,500 submariners died in them. Measured against the small number of men who actually took the boats to sea, that was the highest rate of loss of any part of the United States Armed Forces in the war. The silent victory was not cheap. The scale of what those few boats achieved comes into focus when it is set beside the other great submarine campaign of the war, the one waged by German U-boats against Allied shipping in the Atlantic. Germany committed far more to that effort, and it ended in defeat. The Germans lost 783 U-boats and around 30,000 submariners, roughly 3/4 of their entire submarine force, and for all that sacrifice they could not sever the Atlantic lifeline, because the Allies answered them with a vast, coordinated system of convoys, escorts, aircraft, and code-breaking of their own. The Americans in the Pacific lost 52 boats. With that small force they accomplished against Japan precisely what the far larger German effort failed to accomplish against the Allies, the strangulation of an enemy's seaborne supply, and they did it against an island empire even more dependent on imports than Britain was. The difference was not the courage of the submariners on either side. It was that Japan never built the answer the Allies built in the Atlantic, and so the smaller campaign succeeded completely where the larger one had failed. And the sailors on the other side, the crews of the Maru fleet who carried the Empire's oil through waters they could not defend, died in numbers that ran into the tens of thousands, in a campaign their own navy had never taken seriously enough to protect them from. When the war was over, and the investigators sat across the table from the men who had run the Imperial Navy, the enduring lesson was not written in the language of the decisive battle at all. It was written in the ledgers of sunken tonnage and vanished oil. The Japanese officer of the escort command, asked what had hurt his country most, did not name a fleet or a battle. He named the submarines, and called them the most terrible attack force of the war. It was the closest thing to an answer that the men who could not explain their defeat ever managed to give. The Empire had been strangled, quietly and methodically, by a weapon it had dismissed, aimed at a target it had failed to guard, guided by secrets it never knew were stolen. And the great battle it had waited for across 40 years was, in the end, the one thing that never came. If this account gave you something worth thinking about, leave a like and subscribe. That is what keeps these deep dives coming, and what puts the next one in front of the right audience.